Like Hannah said, I am Tristin Wolfcope. I'm the Regulatory Compliance Manager at Biodesix. I also oversee our biorepository. Today, I'm just going to kind of walk you through our journey of going from a good sample inventory process to a really robust biorepository using our data management system with LabKey. So a little bit about Biodesix. We are a leading data-driven diagnostic solutions company with a primary focus on lung disease. We do run our own commercial testing out of our 2 best-in-class, highly certified clinical laboratories. We run our IQ Lung portfolio out of our Colorado lab and our Notify Lung portfolio out of our Kansas lab. In addition to our commercial processing, we also do a lot of biopharma partnering in both of those labs. We develop diagnostic solutions to support biopharma, diagnostic, and academic partners to bring novel therapies to market. With this, we have a lot of experience in this realm. We have worked with over 60 different companies to work on projects and partnerships. And with those projects, we have accumulated over time about 150,000 samples and data in our biobank. So we have a very large biorepository inventory. And with that come a lot of challenges. So one of the biggest challenges that we've been facing with sample management is really working with a manual system. And I feel like this is kind of the theme for the day. But I got involved with biorepository around mid-2021 when we were looking to take our sample inventory process and really make it into a best-in-class biorepository on the same level as our clinical labs. And so I was brought in to kind of do a review of where we were at, what sort of gaps we were seeing against CAP and ISO 23887. And that was how my involvement started. So going through this review and going through our process, we quickly identified a lot of the same issues that you see with any other manually maintained data process, specifically a lot of incomplete associated data for our samples, manifests and other data that were saved outside of the master inventory log. There was missing a lot of standardized method of that data management. So the inventory log that was being maintained by the personnel running this process had a certain set of fields that didn't always fit the samples that we were receiving into the lab. And so having everything fit in one concise log was hard to do. We also had, with our process, it wasn't as robust as it could be because we didn't have a system set in place. And so we had a little bit of training telephone where pieces being passed through different personnel and turnover, we kind of lost some of the really important steps. So we quickly identified that our processes were good, our people were good, and our inventory was really good. Our physical samples were in a really good spot. It was just gathering all of that associated important data and finding a system to fit that and maintain it. So once we identified this, we knew that we were going to grow the biorepository department. We knew that we wanted it to be really robust in the data because the associated data to go with samples is huge and it's so important. And so the first step was to really gather all of the data that we had and compile it into one file. So to start that, I reached out to department stakeholders and I basically asked for any and all data that they could give me. Once all of that data was in my hands, I actually located all of it, compiled, and verified over 160 different individual manifests into one master file. So I added a lot of fields to make sure we gathered all of that data for each sample set, verified a couple duplicate entries, and really just pulled together as much as I could. Once we had this data in a good spot, the next step was to physically verify all of our inventory against the data that we were able to compile. The goal of this activity was to have one master inventory log that we could then use as a migration tool into a sample management system. So the first step with that was creating this big master inventory log. Once that was done, we actually conducted a full 100% QC of our freezers in both the Colorado and the Kansas location. We went into this with the expectation that we were going to include all biological material and associated data. We verified all of the samples in the freezers real time against the manifest that we were using. Not only were we identifying and validating sample identifiers and adding any additional identifiers that we saw on the physical samples, But we also verified and recorded the physical locations of all of those samples all the way down to their location in their box within the freezer. Any discrepancies that we identified real time, whether it was a transcription error, missing a digit, had an extra digit, we reviewed those and corrected those real time. This also included logging a lot of samples that I did not get data for when I compiled everything. We went into the inventory project with an expected volume of about 105,000 samples, and we ended the activity closer to 150,000. So we logged a lot of stuff real time, and as we logged samples, we were able to reach out to departments and try and gather a little bit more information that they were able to find. Once we were done with this activity, we kind of took all of the information that we had and we made decisions on samples and provided recommendations regarding samples that either didn't have the associated data or were otherwise untraceable. Once we kind of weeded out those samples, we had our final true inventory log ready to go into a sample management system. So then the next step was, well, we need a sample management system. So we did a lot of demos. We did 4 demos with different sample management system companies, and LabKey was one of the last ones, if not the last one. And right from the beginning, it was very obvious that that was the one for us, from both a technical and a personnel perspective. So looking at a sample inventory and wanting to go to a more robust and compliant biorepository space, some of the big key things there were the audit trails. So not only are the audit trails easy to pull, but they're also really easy to read, which you wouldn't think matters, but it really matters a lot when you're trying to trace activity and movement in the system. Having that cloud hosted and database encryption is big too, and the data backups with the retention and the daily backups. One thing looking at a future state of our process was the unlimited sample types and the unlimited number of samples. So our sample volume is big. I feel like we have a lot of samples in our freezers. And so knowing that we're not going to get capped out at number of samples is really important. And then having unlimited sample types as well. So with all of those biopharma partnerships that we do, we also get a lot of different types of samples in our labs. And so being able to accurately identify and trace those instead of having to trying to fit it into a different sample type is really key for that traceability and that good data. We also appreciated that there was a validation package available, which we did take advantage of, that I will speak about in a minute. But all of those technical considerations really helped it be part of our biorepository system and our really robust data. From a personnel consideration, it was just so intuitive. Everybody that was on the demo, all of our stakeholders in our departments were really able to follow the process. And I know Hannah just did a demo, and it was kind of that same thing of, you can drill down to a box view, you can see the lineage of samples. There's so many options for reporting and filtering. And so being able to see it and work with it in a really easy manner makes training of other personnel and onboarding really easy to do. One thing that Hannah touched on as well is the customization of storage. So with our sample inventory, we do have a lot of legacy documents, or excuse me, a lot of legacy samples. And with that comes a lot of weird storage. It just happens. The longer you store samples, you just kind of get a mishmash of things. And so being able to accurately track the samples that we had in the freezer already, whether that was a 9x9 box, a 10x10 box, an 8x12 box, or boxes that we're utilizing the bag function for, being able to match it to what we currently had was really important. And really with LabKey, it was the idea that it was a biological material and associated data system with a huge emphasis on that associated data. Our sample inventory was good. Our sample inventory was trackable and traceable, but being able to tie all of that data to our samples in one location was really what we were looking for and really the key to us going with LabKey. So there's a whole bunch of other benefits, obviously, with LabKey, but the big ones for us were compliance, having that workflow management, being able to move through the system in a sample-centric manner, and also having those relations to sources and aliquots were really the big selling points for us that we were excited about. So we went with LabKey. Once we had established that relationship, we had a trial instance that was built as well as our production inventory site. We were able to create and build everything that we wanted for our process in the trial and use it and try it out and test it out. There was a lot of creative problem solving around sample naming, but we had the space to do that with the idea that our validation would occur in the trial and then everything that we built would be ready to go in production. So we created and finalized our source types. We built out our full freezer maps. We did all of our naming patterns, and then we got our validation from Compliance Path. And my quality engineer will tell everybody and anybody that the package that we received from Compliance Path for our validation is one of the best third-party validations that we've seen. It was really thorough, really well done. We got it in a pretty quick turnaround. I think it was about 3 weeks when we received it. And once we had that and we reviewed it, we did a gap assessment between their validation that they did and our intended use to identify anything that we potentially would need to validate on our own. Once we did that review, we identified that the only thing that was missing was validating those user roles and the associated permissions. So we validated those in our trial site. And once those were done and good to go and signed off, then we went live in production. So we migrated our entire inventory into LabKey. I migrated it on my own. It was per freezer. So we migrated about 11 freezers between both sites, and we went fully live in February of this year. So we have been in there live for a few months, and we have a lot of things that we love, things that we have really been utilizing pretty heavily. One of the biggest things is the traceability and the lineage management. So Hannah kind of touched on this in her demo, but I'll kind of explain how we fit that into what we were doing. So the way that we built it, we have 4 source types that are built in our system. We have 1 source type for each kind of work stream that comes through the lab. It's really more of a department level work stream. So we have our biopharma, we have research, and then a couple other departments. And so that's kind of our first way of grouping projects to the right owners and the right departments. From there, we have source IDs within each of those source types that are specific for projects in that work stream. So we'll have an incoming project and we will go ahead and create a source ID for that project. And then we trace all of our samples through there. That's been really helpful for us because we sometimes have multiple projects going on at once. A lot of the times it's multiple projects with the same partner. And so being able to very easily track and identify individual project samples is really important for us. We also utilize this as kind of a one-stop shop for project data. The fields that we have utilized for source IDs, we have fields that are required for sample disposition upon completion of projects, any external identifiers that we need to keep an eye on because samples come in with those external identifiers. So being able to pair it with our internal identifier is really important. We also have fields for internal and external project contacts in case there's any issues or we need to reach out to anybody. And then we're also utilizing the attachment field at this level so that we can attach any sort of governing documentation that we would need to reference back to. So whether it's our sample processing form, if it's an SOW or an MTA, any sort of documentation that's relevant to those samples being in the biorepository, we can just attach to that source ID and everything is readily available. The next piece of it was where our creative problem solving came in. We had a lot of good processes with our manual data management that were working and we didn't really want to change or mess with. So one of those was sample naming. We were able to mirror what we were doing manually in LabKey with project-driven naming of samples. So our naming pattern is set up that it pulls the first part of that sample name from its source ID project, and then it tells whatever sample it is, whether it's plasma or DNA, and then it has a counter. This was really key because it's a lot easier for the lab to identify the samples that they're supposed to be working with by seeing very easily, here's the project that these samples belong to, here's what these actual samples are, and then here's the numbers that I'm pulling from. The other thing that we implemented with this sample naming is that we actually have individual counters depending on the source ID. So if I am accessioning five samples for one project, and then I accession 1 for another, and then I go back to the first project, it's going to continue that original numbering. So that's been a really nice automatic step that we've implemented that's just been easier for everybody. And then to kind of close out the journey of the sample through the labs, we actually use the Lineage for our eluates that go back into our freezers. So a lot of the samples that we receive into the lab are going to be plasma, which then get processed through the laboratory, and then they come back to us as DNA eluates. We can use the Lineage and the traceability in LabKey to tie it back to that parent plasma, which is then tied all the way back to that project ID. So being able to keep track of that and being able to keep our project IDs and our work streams organized has been really key. Another piece that we've been utilizing a lot is workflows, picklists, and jobs. We actually are the reason why Workflow Editor was created. We asked for that as we were building our system. We identified where the lab was going to fit in LabKey. So we, with a biorepository level function, we want to keep it impartial from the lab. And so we decided, and as we were building this out, we kind of figured that the reader role was too restricted. So we wanted the lab to be able to interact with the inventory to an extent. So reader was too restrictive, but the editor role was not restrictive enough. And so we needed to have that happy medium. So the workflow editor role was created, and the intent of it is that we use that as a tool to communicate with the lab, between the lab and biorepository, when samples are ready for processing or when the lab wants to request samples. It's just been a really good tool to keep that communication a little more centralized within LabKey. So we utilize it. Biorepository receives samples, they accession them, assign those unique individual project IDs. They then start a workflow with the project number. They assign it to the lab personnel. The lab personnel gets an email that samples are ready for processing. They complete whatever actions are set within that workflow of processing, return them back to the freezer. And then it's just that back and forth notification and traceability of the samples from freezer to lab back to the freezer. So it all stays within LabKey. It's all audit trailed. It's all backed up. And it's just a one-stop shop for data. So we also have found that picklists are really easy too. Picklists are part of the workflow editor permissions, where they can review the inventory that we have in LabKey, and they can pick and choose samples based on the criteria that they're looking for. This has actually replaced our paper-based request process that we were using previously, and it allows even greater access to data for the lab. So if the lab had an idea of the samples that they wanted and they were aware of the project that they came from, or kind of what the box name was, that was really all they could go off of. But now they can search from that information that they know and then see even more associated data with those samples to help them drive the decisions for which samples they want. And then one of the newer processes that we've implemented is using system-generated sample IDs for use in de-identification. So LabKey generates barcodes and unique sample IDs for every sample that goes in, including anything that has been discarded or deleted. It will not repeat barcodes or IDs, which is huge. We have an honest broker function at Biodesix that has been de-identifying samples manually. And that comes with its own challenges, again, with a manual paper-based process of where did I save this de-identification key? Am I reusing sample identifiers because some other honest broker did it the last time? And so being able to automate and trace this process has really taken the heavy lifting away from our honest brokers. That process has gotten so streamlined because all we need to do is notify biorepository, I have this number of DNA samples that I need to de-identify and this number of plasma samples that I need to de-identify. Those accession numbers are generated by biorepository. Those labels are handed off. The honest broker will physically de-identify those samples and relabel them. And then that relabeled box and that new manifest with all of the associated data then goes back to biorepository for full accessioning and storage into LabKey. That has been really key and really crucial because it now allows those samples available to the lab for different internal projects and different types of validations. So with that, kind of going back to the work list and the pick list ID, these samples are now available to our laboratory. And not only do they have all of that associated data to use to generate their pick list, but they also have a better understanding of what types of samples they're looking at. Moving into LabKey, we've been able to really distinguish what types of samples we use. And so them being able to see, okay, these are all of my DNA samples that I'm choosing from versus here's all the plasma samples that are available to me. Just being able to differentiate between those different types of samples without having to go and physically look in the freezers has been really important. One thing too with the unique Systen generated ideas is with our legacy manifest and our legacy inventory, we had about 10 years worth of samples that we put into LabKey. And when we migrated, everything got a unique barcode just with how we set up our system. And so this is important because we now have eliminated the confusion between multiple sample ones or tube ones between multiple unique projects because everything is individually identifiable. So we have been really excited with LabKey, being able to manage our data better than we had before has been so important, and it's been so helpful, and it has streamlined our processes. And we're now even thinking above and beyond. You know, LabKey is really set up to grow with us as we start to build out our biorepository even more. And the relationship that we've had with LabKey has been really amazing as well. With all of the steps that we've gone through, Hannah has gotten a lot of feedback from me, and whether it's good or bad, it has been taken and received. And there's always opportunities to help us improve what we're doing and help us figure out how to make it fit our systems better. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tristin. That was really great and good to hear kind of the validation piece of it, and the scale that you guys are working at as well is pretty great. So again, encouraging folks to sort of add questions within the Q&A panel here. No surprise to anyone that I have some of my own. So I'll ask you a couple different questions if we get time for. I'm wondering, especially in kind of your regulated environment, what is the feedback loop like between the folks in the lab doing the work and you for improvements or changing the system, and how do you go about sort of making those changes as needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have been just kind of slowly integrating this into the lab space because biorepository is separate from the lab. We've been trying to make it fit the current manual processes that we use. So prior to LabKey, each project would get its own working manifest that would be maintained manually, of course, within that specific project. And that would be shared with the lab to then generate their manual result Excel file. And that process works. That process works for them right now. And so by using LabKey and exporting those manifests and providing to the lab for them to copy paste that information has been a good first step. But I think that we have an opportunity to fully go into LabKey and use those manual result Excel files and use those in the assays function. We're not quite there yet because it is a good process that works for the lab, but that is my goal. And that is just going to take some baby steps of showing them LabKey, getting them comfortable in the system, and then very lightly suggesting it.
Awesome. And then I've got another question here. You really, you talked a lot about kind of the migration process and what that was like for you. Do you have any learnings or advice to share people who might be looking to undergo that process or are currently undergoing that process of what you might have done differently or what even what the product could do to do better as well?
Yeah. So one thing that I learned that I think I would do differently, because our inventory was so large, it took quite a while to get everything ready to go for migration. I wanted it to be a one-time migration. And so I was maintaining this manual master inventory for so long. And so by the time I got to migration, business operations never stopped. And so I ran into some issues with moving of locations of boxes. So I would recommend doing it in a rolling manner, just to make sure that maybe a freezer at a time even, of I know everything in this freezer is accurate today. knowing that once it's in LabKey, I can freely move those samples around if I need to, instead of waiting so long. And there's been so much movement because it took 3 months to build the inventory. One thing I think, and I think, Hannah, I have given you this feedback, but I did the migration on my own, and I ended up doing it per freezer because there is not really a migration mode for LabKey that I've seen with other systems where it will kind of just shift things around a little bit. And so when I was migrating, because my inventory had shifted around a little bit since I built the spreadsheet, it did error out when a box wasn't the right size or a box no longer existed where I told it was going to go. And so it took a little bit of back and forth effort on my part, because it would migrate all of the samples up to that error point, and then it would just fully stop. And so to get my numbering and my barcodes right, I would have to delete all of the samples that had already migrated, fix the issue, and then remigrate. So I would recommend a migration mode that would give you all of the errors at once, so you could fix those knowing that once all of them are done, it will go through one time.
Yeah, and definitely have heard that feedback, seen this issue with, with other people as well. We're kind of running into it. Or actively trying to work on this and hopefully make it a lot easier to do the migration and imports in general. So thanks so much for being a strong voice for that feedback. We really appreciate it.
Anytime.
And then I think we've got time for one more question here that somebody's asked. Tristin, what made you select LabKey over other LIMS solutions that were available in the market?
Yeah, so I think that's why we're a little bit unique from other LabKey users. We don't use LabKey as a LIMS. We have our own LIMS that's already built and established and is working well. The intended use of LabKey for us is strictly biorepository purposes. And so looking at all of the LIMS functionalities of other sample management systems and LabKey, not really on our radar, not really an intended use. I would love to utilize it as a LIMS for more biopharma projects in the future. I think that using electronic lab notebooks would be amazing for biopharma projects, but in terms of laboratory operations, it's separate from LabKey. We are really in a true biorepository function in the system.